The morning Willa Crane turned 18, the sky over Tucson was the color of an old scar. Not pink, not gold. The kind of pale, washed-out gray that comes before the desert heat burns everything clean. She stood at the window of her room at St. Anne's Home for Children and watched a hawk circle above the dry hills in the distance. It didn't seem to be hunting anything. It just circled, patient, unhurried, like it had nowhere better to be. Willa understood that feeling better than most. She had packed the night before. Everything she owned fit into a single backpack. 2 changes of clothes, a small toiletry bag, a paperback novel with a cracked spine. She had read 4 times and $43 she had saved over 2 years from doing extra kitchen shifts. That was it. That was the whole inventory of 18 years of living. She had zipped the bag closed, set it by the door, and sat on the edge of her bed for a long time without moving. Most of the younger kids thought turning 18 was the best day of your life. They talked about it the way other people talked about Christmas. Freedom. No more curfews. No more chore rotations. No more being told when to sleep and when to wake and what to eat for breakfast. They counted down the days on the backs of their bedroom doors with pencil marks like prisoners scratching time into stone. Willa had never counted down anything. She had watched enough kids turn 18 and walk out that front door to know that freedom and having somewhere to go were 2 completely different things. Freedom without direction was just another word for alone. And Willa had been alone for as long as she could remember, so she wasn't exactly celebrating the official paperwork version of it. She picked up her backpack at 7 in the morning and carried it down the long hallway toward the director's office. The floorboards creaked under her feet the same way they always had, the same loose board just outside room 4, the same hollow thump near the bathroom door. She had memorized every sound in this building over the years without ever meaning to. That was what happened when a place became your whole world. You learned it the way you learned your own heartbeat, without thinking, without choosing. Howard Finch was already at his desk when she knocked. He was a thin man in his early 60s with reading glasses perpetually balanced on the end of his nose and a cardigan that had lost its shape sometime around the turn of the century. He had been director of St. Anne's for as long as Willa had been there, which meant she had known his face longer than any other face on earth. He was not a cruel man. He was not a warm man either. He occupied the careful middle ground of someone who had learned to manage feelings the way an accountant manages numbers, efficiently, without excess. He looked up when she entered, and for just a moment something moved behind his eyes, something she couldn't quite read. A flicker, like a candle in a room with a draft. "Willa," he said, "close the door." She sat down in the chair across from him. She had sat in that chair more times than she could count, for behavior discussions, for school progress reviews, for the handful of times prospective foster families had come and gone without choosing her. She knew the exact grain of the wood on the armrests. She knew the way the afternoon light hit the far wall at 3 o'clock and turned everything amber. Finch did not begin with the usual speech. He didn't talk about the transition resources packet or the contact information for the county employment office or the reminder about the 6-month emergency housing program. He had given that speech dozens of times, and she had watched him give it, and it had always sounded like something read from a form. Instead, he opened the bottom drawer of his desk. He reached inside and pulled out an envelope. It was old, not recently old like something that had been sitting in a drawer for a year or two. This was genuinely old, the kind of old you could feel in the paper itself, the slight brittleness of it, the way the edges had gone soft with time. It was sealed with a strip of tape that had yellowed and curled at one corner, and on the front, written in a careful, unhurried hand, were 2 words, "Willa Crane." She stared at it. "Where did that come from?" she asked. Finch set it on the desk between them. He took his glasses off and set them beside it. Without them, his face looked older, more exposed. "A lawyer brought it," he said. 13 years ago. You were 5 years old. He was a man named Aldridge from a firm in Phoenix. He said I was to hold it until your 18th birthday and give it to you then and only then." He paused. He was very specific about that. Willa looked at the envelope and did not touch it yet. What's in it? I don't know. I never opened it. She looked at him. In 13 years, you never opened it. No. She studied his face for a moment. The flicker was back. Smaller this time. Controlled. Did you know who sent it? She asked. Finch was quiet for a beat too long. No, he said. It wasn't a clean no. It had texture to it. She filed that away and reached for the envelope. The tape gave easily when she peeled it back. Inside were three things. She took them out one at a time and laid them on the desk. The first was a key. It was heavier than she expected, made of dark metal, almost black with a square bow and a long barrel. Old-fashioned. The kind of key that belonged to a lock that had been built to last, not to be convenient. It sat in her palm with a weight that felt deliberate, like it was reminding her it was real. The second was a map, hand-drawn on paper that had aged to the color of weak tea carefully folded into quarters. She unfolded it slowly. It showed a stretch of terrain she didn't immediately recognize. Mountain ridges, a dry riverbed, a dirt road that wound for miles before ending at a small X, marked in the same dark ink as everything else. The X was near what appeared to be a ridgeline with a note beside it that read, "Follow the eastern trail to the third formation." The door is in the rock. She read that twice. The third item was a letter, a single sheet of paper folded once. When she opened it, there was only one sentence written on it, centered on the page, in that same careful handwriting. The house inside Mason Ridge now belongs to you. She sat with that sentence for a moment. The room was very quiet. Outside, she could hear two of the younger kids arguing about something in the hallway, their voices muffled through the door. Mason Ridge, she said. Where is that? Finch picked his glasses back up and put them on. East of Tucson, out past Wilcox up into the Dos Cabezas range. It's very remote. He hesitated. There's not much out there. Then what house? He had no answer for that, or if he did, he wasn't offering it. She looked at the map again, then at the key, then at the single sentence on the page. She thought about the $43 in her backpack. She thought about the bus station 4 blocks from St. Anne's. She thought about the hawk she had watched from the window, circling without purpose above the hills. Do you know anything else? She asked him. Anything at all? Finch looked at his desk. He looked at the envelope. He looked at the yellow tape she had peeled back and left curled on the wood. No, he said again. That no had even more texture than the first one. She put the key and the map and the letter back in the envelope. She folded the top down carefully and put it in the front pocket of her backpack. Then she stood up, picked up the backpack, and walked toward the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame and turned back. Thank you, she said, for keeping it. Finch nodded once. He looked smaller behind his desk than she had ever noticed before, like the room had grown around him. She walked out into the hallway and didn't look back. The bus station smelled like diesel and stale coffee and the specific exhaustion of people who had been traveling too long. Willa bought a ticket to Wilcox with 13 of her $43 and sat on a plastic bench with her backpack between her feet and the envelope in her lap. She unfolded the map again and studied it while she waited. The hand-drawn lines were precise. Whoever had made this map knew the terrain intimately. The distances were marked in approximate miles. The trail markers were specific enough to be useful, and the elevations were noted at several key points. This was not a casual sketch. This was a document made by someone who expected it to be followed possibly years or decades after it was drawn. The bus ride to Wilcox took 2 hours. She watched the city give way to suburb, give way to highway, give way to the open desert. Arizona in late morning was a specific kind of vast. The sky pushed down on the land, and the land pushed back, and everything between them was light and heat, and the occasional stand of saguaro standing with their arms raised as if in permanent weary surrender. She had lived her whole life in Tucson and had almost never left it. The world outside felt both enormous and indifferent, which was somehow easier to deal with than the world inside, which had been small but full of other people's needs and schedules and expectations. Out here, there were no expectations. Out here, the land just existed the same way it had existed before anyone arrived, and the same way it would exist after everyone was gone. In Wilcox, she bought a bottle of water from a gas station and found the edge of town where the paved road gave way to packed dirt. She checked the map. The trail heading east matched what she was looking at. She started walking. The heat came at her in waves. This was desert heat, which is different from the kind of heat people who have never lived in the desert imagine. It doesn't just sit on you. It presses in from every direction simultaneously, from the ground, through the soles of your shoes, from the air against your arms, from above, in a direct, uncompromising column. Willa had lived in Arizona her whole life and she still felt it. But she walked steadily, not fast, not slow, conserving what she had. The dirt road narrowed after the first mile. Then it became a trail. The trail wound through scrub brush and around formations of pale rock that jutted from the earth like the bones of something enormous buried long ago. The mountains ahead were closer now, brown and angular against the sky. She checked the map twice more. She found the second trail marker where the map said it would be a flat rock with an old metal post driven into its surface. The marking on the post almost too worn to read, but still there. The third formation the map referenced was a cluster of large boulders arranged in a rough triangle, and she saw them from 200 yards away. Beyond them, the ridge face rose almost vertically, and there, exactly where the X on the map said it would be, was a door. She stopped walking. It was wooden old set directly into the rock face, as if the mountain had grown around it rather than been carved to receive it. Two windows flanked it on either side, small and square, their glass clouded with dust and age. Above the doorframe, cut into the stone in letters that had been precise once and were now softened by decades of sun and wind, were the words Earl Mason, 1971. She stood in front of it for a long time. The wind moved through the scrub behind her. A lizard crossed the rock face several feet to her left and disappeared into a crack. Somewhere above her, a bird called once and then went quiet. She took the key from the envelope. The lock was iron old but solid, built into the door at chest height. When she slid the key in, it went smoothly, like it had been waiting. She turned it slowly. The mechanism inside moved with more resistance than she expected, the grinding of metal parts that had been dormant but not broken. Then something gave, a deep, solid click, and the door opened inward. The air that came out was cool and still and smelled of dust and stone and something else underneath, something mineral like water far away. She stepped inside. The room was small, simple. A wooden table sat in the center with a single chair pushed in against it. A narrow bed was built into the far wall, its mattress covered with a canvas tarp. Shelves lined the left side of the room from floor to ceiling, packed with books of every size. Their spines faded, their titles barely legible in the dim light that filtered through the dusty windows. A lantern hung from an iron hook in the ceiling. She set her backpack down on the table and looked around. Everything was old, but nothing was broken. The wood of the shelves was dry but solid. The books showed no mold. The lantern still had oil in it. This was a room that had been left carefully by someone who knew how to leave things so they would last. There was nothing personal on the walls, no photographs, no decorations, only the shelves, the books, and a wooden peg near the door where a coat had once hung and no longer did. She turned to the shelves. The books were mostly technical engineering texts, hydrology references, geological surveys, topographical studies. There were a handful of fiction novels mixed in paperbacks with cracked spines and water-stained covers, the kind of books that get read many times in a place with few other entertainments. And on the bottom shelf, set apart from the others, were 3 notebooks with black covers. She left them for the moment and looked at the rest of the room. At the back, where she had assumed was simply a wall, there was an opening. Not a door, just a passageway cut directly into the stone, continuing deeper into the mountain. A hallway, narrow enough that she would have to go through it somewhat sideways if she didn't want to brush both walls. She took the lantern down from its hook. Matches were in a small tin on the shelf beside the lantern, and she lit it on the second try. The flame caught and steadied, throwing warm amber light against the stone walls. She walked into the hallway. The temperature dropped noticeably with every step. The rock on either side was smooth in some places and rough in others, bearing the marks of the tools that had cut it. This had not been done quickly. This had been done by someone with patience and purpose, carving into the heart of a mountain inch by inch, until there was something where there had been nothing. The hallway was longer than she expected, 20 feet, then 30. The stone absorbed sounds so completely that her own footsteps seemed muffled, like the mountain was swallowing the noise before it could echo. And then she saw the pipes. They appeared on the left wall first. Metal, old but not rusted through a dark matte finish that suggested they had been treated against corrosion, coated with something that had held up across the decades. They ran horizontally along the wall for a few feet and then curved upward into the ceiling and disappeared. She stopped and looked at them. More pipes appeared on the right wall. Thicker ones. They ran in the opposite direction, descending into the floor. She held the lantern closer. The pipes were connected at intervals by joints and valves, and the valves had handles on them, flat iron handles that had been painted red at some point and had faded to the pale ghost of red over time. She kept walking. The hallway opened without warning. One moment she was in a narrow passage barely wide enough for her shoulders, and the next she was standing in a room so large the lantern light barely reached the far wall. It was a cavern, not natural or not entirely natural. The walls had been shaped, the ceiling smoothed to a rough arch. The floor was level, poured concrete, cracked in places but fundamentally intact. And filling every inch of available space were machines. They were enormous. Steel tanks stood against the walls, each one 10 or 12 feet tall, connected to each other and to the pipes in the walls and ceiling by a web of metal tubing that ran in every direction, methodical and complex, like the inner workings of something living. Gauges were mounted on the tanks at regular intervals, their faces obscured by dust, but their needles still visible, pointing at various positions on their dials. Levers jutted from pipes at key junctions, labeled with small metal plates. Valves the size of steering wheels were mounted at intervals on the larger pipes. And in the center of the room, elevated slightly on a concrete platform, was the control station. It was a console 6 feet wide, its surface covered with instrumentation. Switches, gauges, manual controls, a row of indicator lights behind their clouded glass housings. At the top of the console centered was a screen. Old technology, the kind that had been cutting edge once and was now simply ancient, a gray rectangle roughly the size of a paperback novel set into the console's face behind scratched protective glass. Willa walked toward it slowly. She set the lantern on the edge of the console and looked at it. Then she looked around the room again. The sheer scale of it was difficult to process. This had not been built by one man over a weekend. This had been built over years, maybe decades, by someone with engineering knowledge, an extraordinary commitment, and a reason large enough to justify all of it. She reached out and wiped the console face with the hem of her shirt. Dust came away in a gray smear, revealing more switches, more labels, the edge of a metal nameplate she couldn't fully read yet. She wiped again. The nameplate read, Mason Ridgewater Authority, Valley Distribution Control. She straightened up and looked at it. Valley Distribution Control. Not just one property, not just one well. A system designed to manage water for an entire valley. She thought about the scale of the piping she had seen in the hallway, the size of the tanks in this room, the complexity of the network that connected everything together. This was infrastructure. This was the kind of thing that kept a region alive. And it had been sitting here inside a mountain, sealed behind a wooden door with an iron lock for God knows how long. Then the screen came on. It didn't announce itself loudly. There was no alarm, no dramatic sound. The screen simply began to glow faintly at first, like an ember being breathed back to life after a long, cold night. The glow strengthened. The indicator lights along the top of the console flickered. The machines around her shifted from silence into something that was barely more than silence, a deep, almost subsonic hum that she felt more in her chest than heard with her ears. And then text appeared on the screen letter by letter in a slow, deliberate font that looked like it had been designed for someone with time to read. Mason Ridge Water Authority, Valley Distribution Control System, status dormant, 847 days since last keeper activity. Then a pause. The cursor blinked, and then a new line appeared, initiating identity verification. The hum in the machines deepened. She could hear something moving far below her, somewhere beneath the concrete floor, deep in the stone beneath the mountain. A slow, heavy, rhythmic vibration, like water moving through pipes that had been dry for a very long time. Then the screen changed. Identity verification complete. And below that, in letters slightly larger than everything else on the screen, "Welcome back, Mason Bloodline." Willa did not move for a long time. She read the words 3 times, 4 times. Then she stepped back from the console and looked at the screen as if distance might change what it said. It didn't. She had no family. She had never had family. Her intake file at St. Anne's was a single page, and the family information section had 2 words printed in it: unknown abandoned. She had read that file once at age 13 when Finch had left it on his desk and stepped out of the room. She had stood in his office and held those 2 words in her mind and then put the file back down and never asked to read it again. Not unknown, not abandoned, Mason Bloodline. She turned away from the console and walked back to the entrance room. She pulled one of the black notebooks from the bottom shelf and brought it back into the machine room, where the light from the waking console was stronger than the lantern she carried. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was the same as on the envelope, the same as on the single-sentence letter. The first page read simply, "Notes of the Valley Keeper." Below that, a date, 1971. She began to read. Earl Mason had been a hydraulic engineer. He had come to the Mason Ridge Valley in the mid-1960s when a prolonged drought had begun threatening the farms and small towns that depended on the valley's groundwater. He had spent 3 years surveying the region before discovering what the geological surveys had missed: a network of deep freshwater aquifers running beneath the mountain range, fed by snowmelt from the higher elevations to the north, naturally filtered through layers of limestone, capable of sustaining the entire valley through even the worst dry years if the water was properly managed. The problem, Earl wrote, was that deep aquifer water couldn't be managed from the surface. The pressure dynamics were too complex, the variables too numerous. To do it properly, the control point had to be underground, as close to the source as possible, where the pressure could be read directly and the distribution adjusted in real time. So he built it. He spent 6 years cutting the house into the mountain. He ran the pipes. He built the control station. He engineered the distribution network that fanned out beneath the valley floor, branching into smaller and smaller channels until it reached every farm, every municipal well, every irrigation system in the region. And he built it so that no single person, no company, no government entity could own it or control it exclusively. The water belonged to the valley. The keeper's job was not to own the system, but to tend it, to make sure it stayed balanced, to make sure the water reached everyone. She read for a long time. The console hummed around her. Somewhere far below, water was moving through pipes that had been quiet for nearly 3 years. She could feel it, a subtle aliveness in the floor beneath her feet, like the mountain was breathing. Then the screen changed again. A new line appeared, pulsing red. Unauthorized extraction detected. Garland Agricultural Zone Sector 7. Duration 847 days continuous. Current extraction rate 340% above authorized limit. She looked at the screen, then she looked at the notebook in her hands, then back at the screen. Below the warning, the system generated a map. Simple schematic, but clear enough. The valley floor spread across the screen in a grid of blue lines representing the distribution network. Most of the lines were pale thin, barely flowing. But at one location in the southeastern quadrant, a cluster of thick lines converged on a single property and stopped. The lines didn't continue beyond that property. They ended there, every one of them. And that single property was highlighted in a steady pulsing red. She leaned in and read the label over the highlighted zone. Garland Agricultural Holdings, private extraction pumps active. She straightened up. She thought about what 847 days meant. Not weeks, not a month. 847 days of someone actively pulling water out of the valley's underground system at more than 3 times the authorized rate, while the rest of the valley dried up, while farms failed, while wells ran low or ran dry, while families watched their land turn to dust and didn't know why. 847 days of that. She set the notebook down on the concrete floor and sat beside it and kept reading. The second half of the first notebook detailed the system's technical operations. She skimmed those sections, noting the relevant information but not stopping on the engineering specifications. It was the third notebook that drew her attention after she finished the first. She opened it expecting more technical documentation and found instead something different. Smaller entries, more personal. Written in the same hand as the first notebook, but closer together, the letters slightly more pressed, as if the writer had been tired or deliberate or both. The entries in this notebook covered a different period of time, more recent. They talked about changes in the valley, about water pressure anomalies Earl had noticed, about conversations he'd had with farmers who didn't understand why their yields were dropping, about a name that appeared more and more frequently as the entries continued. Garland. Boyd Garland. He appeared first as a county official, then as a state bureaucrat, then in later entries as a state senator. Earl had been watching him for years, tracking the correlation between Garland's rise through the various positions that gave him authority over Arizona's water management policies and the slow degradation of the valley's distribution balance. He had written about reporting his observations, about letters sent, about meetings requested and denied, about being told that the data he was presenting was incomplete or misinterpreted or simply not a concern. She read those entries slowly. Then she reached the back of the notebook, the last few pages. The writing here was different again, slightly uneven, the hand of someone older or more tired or both. The second to last page described a backup system Earl had built into the control console, a secondary function separate from the water distribution controls, a data archive. Everything he had recorded over the decades, every measurement, every anomaly, every piece of evidence of unauthorized extraction compressed onto a small drive that could be physically connected to the console and transmitted to multiple external recipients simultaneously. He had built it because he knew what he had documented was too important to exist in only one place. And he had set the transmission protocols so that the recipients would only receive the data if the drive was connected by an authorized keeper. His insurance, his legacy, dormant for years waiting. She turned to the last page. The handwriting on this page was the most uneven of all, slow and careful in the way of someone who knew these were final words. The entry was not addressed to the world. It was not a general instruction for whoever might come after. It was addressed to someone specific. It began, "If Willa finds this, then my prayers were answered, and she is safe." Willa stopped breathing for a moment. She had to read the next line several times before they settled into meaning. She was never abandoned. She was hidden. There is a difference. Ruth hid her to protect her, and I helped Ruth do it, and I have carried that weight every day since, because hiding her also meant leaving her alone. I want her to know that we thought of her every day. I want her to know that the house and everything in it now belongs to her, not because she is the only option, but because she is the right one. I chose her the same way the system will choose her, because the water knows its own. She closed the notebook. She sat on the floor of the machine room with the notebook in her lap and the console humming above her and the red warning still pulsing on the screen. The lantern flame swayed slightly in a draft that came from somewhere deeper in the mountain. Ruth. She had no last name for Ruth. She had nothing. She had only that single name written in a dead man's handwriting on the last page of a notebook in a hidden room inside a mountain in the Arizona desert. But for the first time in her life, the word abandoned did not sit inside her chest the way it always had. She had not been left. She had been placed, deliberately, carefully, by people who had known her and had reasons she didn't yet understand for what they had done. She sat with that for a long time. Then she stood up. She walked back to the console and looked at the red warning still blinking on the screen. 847 days. More than 2 years. Enough time to do serious, possibly irreversible damage to a water system that an entire valley depended on. She looked at the rows of levers and switches and controls. She looked at the map on the screen, the blue lines gone pale and thin across most of the valley, converging thick and red at that single pulsing property in the southeast. She was 18 years old. She had $43 now, $30 after the bus ticket. She had a backpack and a cracked paperback novel and no family and no plan beyond the next hour. And somehow standing in the center of this ancient machine room, in the heart of a mountain that had apparently been waiting for her, specifically, none of those facts felt quite as definitive as they had this morning. She reached out and put her hand on the edge of the console. The metal was cool under her fingers. The hum traveled up through her palm. The screen pulsed its red warning. Unauthorized extraction detected. Garland Agricultural Zone Sector 7. 847 days continuous. Outside, far away and far below, a valley was drying out one day at a time. And somewhere in the distance, on a road she couldn't yet see, something was already moving. She stood at the console for a long time before she touched anything. That was the right instinct. She knew it even without being told. The room around her was old but not fragile, powerful but not forgiving, and the red warning on the screen had been pulsing for 847 days without anyone here to answer it. One more hour of caution wouldn't hurt anything. Rushing would. She went back to the entrance room and retrieved the other two notebooks from the shelf. She brought them to the machine room and read through the second one, carefully moving her lips slightly over the more technical sections, the way she did when she needed something to stick. The second notebook was almost entirely operational. Earl Mason had written it as a manual, systematic and precise, the kind of document an engineer writes not for himself, but for whoever comes after. He assumed the person reading it would be intelligent, but not trained. He explained each system in plain language before providing the technical specifications. He wrote the way someone writes when they know they won't be there to answer questions. The distribution network had three primary control mechanisms. The first was the flow balance lever. It was the largest single control on the console, a metal lever roughly 2 feet long mounted on a heavy iron pivot, positioned at the left end of the control station. Its function was exactly what the name suggested. When the valley's water distribution fell out of balance, when one area was drawing more than its share, while others went dry, the keeper pulled the lever and the system automatically recalculated the pressure across all distribution channels and corrected the imbalance. It didn't cut anyone off entirely. It redistributed. It was designed to be fair in the way that only a machine can be fair, without favor, without argument, without the capacity to be bribed or threatened or reasoned with. Earl had written a note beside the technical description of the flow balance lever. He had underlined it. This lever does not punish, it corrects. Remember the difference. The second mechanism was the pressure monitoring system, a set of gauges distributed across the console that gave the keeper a real-time picture of water pressure throughout the distribution network. Most of the gauges were reading low. She walked along the console face and looked at each one. Low, low, critical, low. One gauge on the far right of the panel was reading so far into the red zone that the needle was pressed hard against the upper stop pin. That gauge was labeled Sector 7 Garland Agricultural. The third mechanism was the mountain lock. It had its own section in the notebook set apart from the others, and Earl had written the heading in heavier strokes than everything else on the page. She read that section twice and then closed the notebook and set it aside. The mountain lock was not something she needed to think about yet. She went back to the flow balance lever. It was cold under her hand. Not the cold of the room, which was cool and steady, but the specific cold of metal that had been untouched for years, the cold of something waiting. The lever was in the upright position. She could see from the diagram Earl had drawn in the notebook that pulling it down would engage the redistribution sequence. The system would take several minutes to recalculate and adjust. During that time, the machines would be louder. Then the recalculation would complete, and the water would begin moving the way it was supposed to move through all the channels to all the places that it had been going without. She thought about the people in the valley below. She didn't know them. She had never been here before today, but she knew what it meant for a well to run dry because she had read enough of Earl's notebooks to understand the downstream consequences, the crops that failed the livestock, that couldn't be watered, the municipal systems that struggled the families that watched the land their parents and grandparents had worked slowly turn to dust and didn't know why. She pulled the lever down. The reaction was not subtle. The machines came alive around her with a sound like distant thunder rolling upward through the earth. The pipes in the walls shuddered. The floor vibrated beneath her feet with a deep rhythmic pulse. Gauges swung. Indicator lights along the top of the console ran through a rapid sequence, amber to green to amber again, as the system tested each circuit. One of the large tanks against the far wall groaned once, a long metallic complaint, and then went quiet as pressure equalized inside it. On the screen, the schematic map of the valley changed. The pale blue lines that had represented barely flowing water began to darken, slowly at first, then more quickly. The darkening moved outward from the center of the network, spreading through the distribution channels, like color spreading through water dropped into still water, branching and branching until it reached the edges of the map. The lines thickened as they darkened. The pressure gauges across the console began climbing out of their low zones. Except for the Sector 7 gauge. That one stayed where it was. She looked at the map. The Garland agricultural zone in the southeastern quadrant was still highlighted red. The system had redistributed the water across the valley, but the unauthorized extraction pumps were still running. The system could correct the distribution balance. It couldn't physically stop the pumps on another property from pulling water out of the underground pipes. That would require the pressure in the Garland extraction lines to drop below the pump's operational threshold. And that would take time. Hours, maybe, or something more direct. The screen updated again as the redistribution sequence completed. Flow balance restored 94% network coverage. Remaining disruption Sector 7. Unauthorized extraction ongoing. System note. External pump interference exceeds correction capacity. She studied the map. The system had zoomed in slightly on the Garland property now that the rest of the network was stabilizing, and she could see more detail than before. The property boundaries were marked. Inside them, the schematic showed something she hadn't fully registered in the earlier, more distant view. The pump network on the Garland property was not a simple operation. There were 5 extraction points shown on the map spread across the property at regular intervals. Each one was connected to the underground distribution pipes by a channel that had been bored directly into the existing infrastructure, not attached at a junction or tapped at a valve, but physically cut into the pipe walls with what must have been industrial boring equipment. This was not the work of someone who had slapped together a quick illegal tap in the middle of the night. This was engineered, planned, executed with significant equipment, in significant expertise, in significant time. And then she saw the label she had missed before. In small text beside each extraction point, the map displayed a construction date. All 5 points had been installed within the same 18-month window. She looked at the dates, then she looked again. She went back to the third notebook, the one with Earl's personal entries, and found the section she remembered. The entries about Garland. She flipped through them until she found the specific notation she was looking for. It took her 4 minutes to find it. When she did, she read it twice. Earl had written in an entry dated several years before his death that he had discovered something while reviewing the state's water management permits. He had obtained the permits through a public records request, the kind of request a private citizen could make, but that rarely got answered quickly or completely. His had taken 14 months. When the documents finally arrived, he had found what he was looking for. The construction permits for the extraction infrastructure on the Garland Agricultural Holdings property had been issued by the Arizona Department of Water Resources. They had been issued legally with full documentation properly stamped and signed. Every one of them. The signature on every single permit was the same. Boyd Garland, Director of Water Resource Allocation, Arizona Department of Water Resources. Earl had underlined the title 3 times. She set the notebook down. She sat with that for a moment. The weight of it. Not a man who had broken the rules in the dark, hoping nobody noticed. A man who had written the rules, signed the permits, authorized his own operation through the office he held, and then moved on to a position of even greater power from which he could ensure that nobody looked too closely at what those permits had enabled. He hadn't stolen anything technically. He had arranged through legitimate institutional channels to give himself legal access to water that by every moral and historical right belonged to the people of the valley. Then he had used that access to take more than 3 times what the permits allowed, which was itself a violation, but the kind of violation that required someone with the technical knowledge and the standing to challenge it. A standing that a dead engineer's granddaughter, 18 years old, in a hidden room inside a mountain demonstrably did not have. She was still sitting with that when the screen changed. External activity detected Eastern Access Road. Motion sensors active. She stood up quickly and moved to the console. The screen had shifted from the distribution map to a different display. Smaller. A grid of boxes, each one labeled with a compass direction and a distance marker. Some of the boxes were dark. 3 of them showed images. Security cameras. Old ones, their resolution, poor, their frames slow updating. But functional. Earl had built them into the rock face outside at intervals, and they had apparently survived the same way everything else in this mountain had survived, through quality of construction and the preserving effect of the dry desert air. The eastern camera, labeled E2, showed a vehicle on the dirt road below the mountain, coming from the direction of the valley, moving at a pace that suggested purpose rather than wandering. It was not a civilian vehicle. Even through the low-resolution image, she could see the light bar on the roof, dark now, unlit, but unmistakable in shape. A sheriff's vehicle. She moved closer to the screen and looked at the other cameras. One showed the bottom of the trail she had walked up from Wilcox. Another showed the area immediately outside the front door. Both were currently empty. The vehicle on the E2 camera disappeared from frame and reappeared a moment later on a closer camera moving up the lower approach road. She could see now that it was a county sheriff's cruiser, and behind it, further back, a second vehicle. Dark pickup truck, newer than the cruiser. No light bar, no markings. 2 vehicles. She thought about the console around her, about the notebooks on the floor, about the hard drive Earl had mentioned in his final entries, the backup drive containing everything he had documented. She hadn't found it yet. She had been so absorbed in reading that she hadn't looked for it, and now she didn't have time to search properly. She picked up the notebooks from the floor. She went to the entrance room and put 2 of them back on the shelf exactly where she had found them. The third notebook, the one with Earl's personal entries and the final pages addressed to her by name, she put in her backpack. Then she went back into the machine room and looked at the console. The console itself was too large to move and too important to abandon. Whatever happened with the people coming up the trail, the system was now running. The water was flowing. That had already happened and couldn't be undone. The screen showed the eastern camera again. The cruiser had stopped at the base of the final approach trail. A door was opening. She looked around the machine room. The light from the console was the only illumination. Now the lantern still burning, but its contribution negligible against the room's size. She looked at the far wall, the one she had given least attention to. It was mostly rock with a few pipes running along its lower half and a section of mounted junction boxes above them. But in the far right corner, almost invisible unless you were specifically looking at it, there was another opening. Not as wide as the hallway she had come through. Narrower. Lower. More like a maintenance access passage than a deliberate corridor. She had to duck to get through it. She went through it with the lantern. The passage was short, 8 feet, maybe 10. It opened into a room roughly half the size of the machine room, and this room was different in character from everything else she had seen. The machine room had been built for function. This room had been built for record keeping. There were filing cabinets along 2 walls, 4 of them old metal with the paint worn off in patches. A wooden desk sat against the third wall, its surface covered with flat document trays, the kind used in offices for sorting papers. The trays held paper still, folders stacked, document boxes on shelves above the desk labeled in Earl's handwriting with dates and categories. And on the desk between the document trays attached to a short cable plugged into a small power supply box that drew from the same electrical circuit as the rest of the mountain house was a device roughly the size of a cigarette pack. A small external hard drive, its activity light blinking a slow, steady green. She stood and looked at it. Then she heard the front door. Not a knock. The sound of someone trying the handle. Then a knock, hard and official, the knock of someone who expects to be heard. She stood very still. "This is the Cochise County Sheriff's Department." The voice was male, middle-aged, carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. It came muffled through the stone in the distance, but she could hear it clearly enough. "We have a court-issued warrant to inspect this property. Anyone inside needs to open this door immediately." She looked at the hard drive. She looked at the filing cabinets. She had perhaps 3 minutes before they found the door unlocked and came through it. Less if they were determined. She went to the nearest filing cabinet and opened the top drawer. It was packed with folders, densely filed, tabbed with dates. She pulled one out at random and opened it. Data sheets, measurements, pressure readings from the distribution network going back decades documented in Earl's hand. Rows and rows of numbers, dates, locations. She pulled out another folder. More data, water flow calculations, comparison charts. She opened the next drawer down. This one held different material. Not data sheets, documents, photocopied pages from public records, correspondence. She could see letterhead, State of Arizona letterhead on several sheets. She was going too fast. She needed to slow down, and she had no time to slow down. She pulled the entire contents of the second drawer and set it on the desk beside the hard drive. She looked at it. 2 inches of folders compressed. More material than she could read in an hour. She heard the front door open. They had tried the handle and found it unlocked. She could hear footsteps on the wood floor of the entrance room, now 2 sets moving with deliberate slowness. She looked at the hard drive again. She disconnected it from its cable. It came free easily, the connector releasing with a small click. She held it for a moment, this small flat rectangle that Earl had spent years filling with the evidence he had built his final years around assembling. She could not take the folders. She could not take the filing cabinet contents or the document boxes on the shelves. There was too much, and she had no way to carry it without being seen immediately. She put the hard drive in the front pocket of her backpack, and then she kept looking because she had another 30 seconds and she was going to use them. She found it in the third drawer of the second filing cabinet. It was a single manila folder, thicker than the others, held closed with a rubber band that snapped when she touched it, dried to brittleness. The label on the tab was not a date or a category. It was a name. Ruth Mason Legal Documents. She stood very still. The footsteps in the entrance room had stopped. She heard a voice say something she couldn't make out. Then a different voice reply, lower, shorter. 2 people, moving now toward the back of the entrance room, toward the hallway. She opened the folder. The first document inside was a legal filing. Standard format, the kind she had seen occasionally on television legal dramas and never in real life. At the top in bold type, Ruth Eleanor Mason Plaintiff versus State of Arizona. Department of Water Resources and Boyd Garland in his official capacity as Director Defendants. Superior Court of Arizona, Cochise County, filed March 14, 2007. She scanned the filing. Her eyes moved fast, pulling out key phrases. Illegal diversion of public water resources. Unauthorized issuance of extraction permits. Conflict of interest. Personal enrichment through public office. The language was formal and precise, and it laid out in the dry vocabulary of legal pleading exactly what Earl had documented in his notebooks. Ruth Mason had taken it to court. She had found a lawyer willing to file it. She had stood up in front of the state of Arizona and said in writing in a public legal proceeding that Boyd Garland was stealing the valley's water. She kept turning pages. Behind the original filing was a series of subsequent documents, motions, responses from the state's attorneys, a hearing notice, another motion, And then near the back of the folder, a single page with a date stamp from October 2007. Motion to dismiss granted. The court had dismissed the case. Insufficient evidence, the ruling stated. The extraction permits in question had been issued through proper channels, and their validity could not be challenged without technical expert testimony that plaintiff had failed to provide. She turned the next page. It was a newspaper clipping photocopied the gray tones of the reproduction, making it slightly hard to read. A short article, not front page, bottom of a local section. The headline read, "Local Woman Killed in Highway Accident." The date was January 2008, 3 months after the case was dismissed. She read the article. Ruth Eleanor Mason, 27, of Cochise County, had been killed when her vehicle left State Route 186 during a nighttime drive. The accident had been attributed to road conditions. No other vehicles were involved. Funeral arrangements were private. 27 years old. The footsteps in the machine room now. She could hear them through the passage, the concrete floor carrying the sound more clearly than the stone walls. They were in the main space. She heard someone say something about the machines. A low whistle of surprise. She turned the last page in the folder. It was a document she recognized by format even before she read the content. She had seen the same form in her own file at St. Anne's, the one she had read at age 13 while Finch was out of his office. She had memorized the layout. It was a birth certificate. Baby girl born November 3, 2006 at Cochise County Regional Medical Center. Mother Ruth Eleanor Mason, age 26. Father listed as unknown. She read the name on the birth certificate. The given name in the designated field was a single word, Willa. She did not breathe for a moment. She stood in the small room inside the mountain and held the folder and did not breathe and let the fact of it settle into her. Ruth Mason had been 26 years old when she gave birth to a daughter she named Willa. She had filed a lawsuit against the state of Arizona and Boyd Garland 7 months later. She had lost that lawsuit in October. She had been dead by January at 27 years old on an empty highway at night, 3 months after the case was dismissed. And her daughter had been placed in St. Anne's Home for Children in Tucson, where she had lived for 18 years as Willa Crane, with a file that said unknown abandoned. The footsteps were close now, right at the entrance to the maintenance passage. She pushed the Ruth Mason folder into her backpack on top of the third notebook. She zipped the bag closed. She straightened up and turned toward the passage entrance, and she was 2 steps from it when the beam of a flashlight swept through the narrow opening and a figure ducked through it and stood in the doorway of the records room. He was a large man in his mid-50s, wearing the olive drab uniform of the Cochise County Sheriff's Department, a silver star on his chest, a wide-brimmed hat pushed back slightly on his head. He had a jaw like something quarried from the same rock as the mountain, and eyes that moved across the room in one sweep, taking inventory the way a man takes inventory who has learned to assess spaces quickly. He was not the type of man who was surprised by things, but there was a half-second pause when he saw her standing there, and in that half-second, something moved behind his quarried jaw and steady eyes. Not surprise, something closer to recognition. He recovered immediately. "Step away from the desk," he said. His voice was the same voice she had heard through the door. Practiced authority, easy in the way of someone who had used it a long time. She stepped away from the desk. "I'm Sheriff Dale Pruitt," he said. "Cochise County." He looked around the records room, his eyes moving across the filing cabinets, the document trays, the shelves. "And you are trespassing on property under state jurisdiction." "This property was left to me," she said. "That's a claim we'll need to verify." He held out a folded document. "I have a court-issued warrant to inspect this facility. That warrant also covers seizure of any materials found on the premises that relate to state water management infrastructure." He paused. "Including documents." She looked at the document he was holding, then at the filing cabinets, then back at him. "You can't take those," she said. "The warrant says I can. Those are private records. That's a private filing cabinet in a private house. This structure sits on land under the jurisdiction of the state of Arizona Water Management Authority," Pruitt said. The infrastructure inside it is classified as public utility property under State Statute 45-141. He put the warrant back in his breast pocket with the calm of someone who is prepared for every objection in the conversation, which means the records stored in this structure are state property, not private property. She understood then, with a clarity that felt like cold water, what she was dealing with. This was not a situation that could be argued out of on the spot. He had a warrant. The warrant cited a specific statute. The statute had presumably been written or amended at some point by someone who had anticipated exactly this kind of situation and had structured the legal framework to foreclose exactly the kind of challenge she might raise. She thought about Earl's notebooks, about the section on who had signed the extraction permits. She thought about Boyd Garland, who had been director of water resource allocation before he became a state senator. She looked at Pruitt. "How long have you been working for him?" she asked. Something tightened in his jaw. Not guilt, more like the controlled response of someone who has been asked a pointed question and has decided to treat it as not worth acknowledging. "My deputy is going to come in here now," he said, "and he's going to box up the contents of those filing cabinets. You're going to stand over by that wall and not interfere." She moved to the wall. The second man came through the passage. Younger than Pruitt, late 20s, with the slightly uncertain manner of someone still learning when to speak. He carried several flat cardboard boxes, the kind that fold into shape, and he began assembling them on the desk with mechanical efficiency. She watched them work. The second deputy pulled folders from the filing cabinets drawer by drawer and placed them in boxes with methodical speed. He moved through the material the way someone moves through something he's been instructed to retrieve in its entirety without reading it. Not curious, just executing. She counted 3 boxes filled before the cabinets were empty. She watched the document trays get cleared. The boxes on the shelves come down. The flat files get stacked. She kept her face still and her hands at her sides, and she stood against the wall and she watched 18 years of Earl Mason's documentation get boxed up and carried through the narrow passage into the machine room and out through the hallway toward the entrance. When the room was empty, Pruitt stood in the doorway and looked at her. "You need to understand something," he said. "This is a state utility facility. The warrant covers the premises. If you're found here again, I'll be charging you with interfering with state infrastructure." She looked at him. "Where am I supposed to go?" she asked. "That," Pruitt said, "is not my concern." He left. She listened to the footsteps move away through the passage, through the machine room, down the hallway, into the entrance room. She heard the front door open and close. She heard faintly the sound of vehicles starting up outside. She waited until she couldn't hear the engines anymore. Then she walked through the passage back into the machine room. The console was still running. The screen still showed the valley distribution map with its darkened blue lines spreading across the network. The flow balance lever was still in the down position where she had left it. The machines hummed their deep, even hum. She sat on the floor in front of the console and took the backpack off and set it in her lap. She unzipped it and looked at what was inside. The third notebook, the Ruth Mason folder, the hard drive. They had taken the filing cabinets. They had taken the document trays and the boxes from the shelves. They had taken, as far as she could tell, the entirety of the records room's visible contents. They had not found the hard drive because it had not been in a filing cabinet or a document tray or a box on a shelf. It had been sitting on the desk, plugged into a power supply in plain sight, and the deputy who had cleared the desk had taken the document trays from it without looking at what else was sitting there. She held it in her hand. This small, flat rectangle. She turned it over. On the back, written in permanent marker in Earl's handwriting, were 5 words. "For Willa, when the time comes." She closed her hand around it. She thought about Pruitt and his warrant and his prepared answers and his flat refusal to acknowledge her question about Garland. She thought about the systematic thoroughness of what had just happened, the speed of it, the legal preparation behind it. People didn't arrive with court-issued warrants within hours of a warning light going off on a remote mountain unless they had been watching for the warning light, unless they had known it was coming, unless someone had told them it was coming. She thought about Howard Finch's office that morning, the flicker behind his eyes when he handed her the envelope, the texture in his denials when she asked if he knew anything. She thought about the timeline. She had received the envelope at approximately 8 in the morning. She had bought a bus ticket within the hour. She had arrived in Wilcox shortly after noon. She had reached the Mountain House by mid-afternoon. Pruitt had arrived with a prepared warrant. A warrant took time to obtain even under expedited circumstances. Even if he had called a judge the moment Finch tipped him off, even if everything had moved at maximum speed, the timing was extraordinarily tight. Unless the warrant had already been prepared, already ready sitting in a drawer somewhere, waiting only for the confirmation that someone had finally arrived at Mason Ridge to trigger its use. Howard Finch had been holding her envelope for 13 years. And he had known for 13 years that someday someone was going to come and ask for it. She sat in the machine room and felt the full shape of what had been arranged on both sides for a long time before she arrived. Earl had spent years preparing the records room building, the backup drive, writing the notebooks. On the other side, Garland had spent years constructing the legal framework to neutralize exactly the threat that Earl's evidence represented. Two men working toward opposite ends, building their preparations into the architecture of institutions and systems and legal documents and remote mountain rooms, both of them dead now, and the whole vast structure of their opposing preparations left standing, waiting for whoever arrived to trigger it. She was the person who had arrived. The console hummed, the water ran through the valley below. The screen displayed its patient ongoing data. She thought about Earl's final words in the notebook. She had not been abandoned. She had been hidden. She thought about Ruth Mason, 27 years old, 3 months after a dismissed lawsuit on an empty highway at night. She thought about Garland, a senator, 3 terms, the man the valley's farmers credited with preserving their water rights, who gave speeches about stewardship of natural resources, who had his photograph taken at the openings of community wells and irrigation projects, whose name was on a scholarship at the state university. She thought about the mountain lock, the section she had read in the notebook and set aside. She wasn't ready for that yet. She opened the Ruth Mason folder again and looked at the birth certificate. At her own name printed in a box on a form in a hospital in Cochise County in November of 2006. Then she closed the folder and looked at the console and thought about what needed to happen next, and in what order, and how much time she might or might not have before the situation moved faster than she was prepared for. Outside, the desert had gone dark. She hadn't noticed the light change absorbed as she had been in everything that had happened inside the mountain. But the cameras on the console screen showed the terrain outside in the dim blue tones of dusk settling over the Arizona landscape. The valley below was dark and quiet. Somewhere under that darkness, water was moving through channels it hadn't moved through in nearly 3 years, finding its way through the network Earl Mason had built with decades of patience and devotion, reaching places that had been dry, filling things that had been empty. She sat with the hard drive in her hand and the folder in her lap, and felt the hum of the mountain around her and the weight of everything she now knew and everything she did not yet know about the woman who had named her and the man who had hidden her here. The red warning was still on the screen. Sector 7, Garland Agricultural Zone, unauthorized extraction ongoing. She looked at it for a long time. Then she heard something outside. Not a vehicle this time. Something different. The creak of the trail, a footstep on the rocky ground. Unhurried, singular, deliberate. The sound of someone who is not trying to surprise you, but wants you to know they are coming. A single set of footsteps walking up the trail toward the door. She was still sitting on the floor when the knock came. 3 knocks, even measured spaced. Not the official hammer of a sheriff's department visit. Not the urgent percussion of someone afraid. The knock of a man who has knocked on difficult doors before and has learned that patience is more persuasive than force. A voice came through the door, older than Pruitt's, smoother. The voice of a man who had spent decades making difficult things sound simple. "Miss Crane," it said, "my name is Boyd Garland. I think it's past time we had a conversation." She did not move immediately. She sat on the floor of the machine room with the hard drive in one hand and the Ruth Mason folder in her lap, and she listened to the silence after his voice and let herself think for exactly 10 seconds before she stood up. 10 seconds was enough. She had been making decisions with less her entire life. She put the hard drive back in her backpack. She put the folder in with it. She zipped the bag closed and put it on her back and walked through the hallway and into the entrance room and stood in front of the door. "I heard you," she said through the wood. "Good," Garland said. "Then you know I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want to talk." She looked at the door. The iron lock was still functional. She had locked it after Pruitt left, working the key from the inside with a secondary mechanism Earl had built into the frame, a simple sliding bolt that dropped into a floor socket. Whoever had designed the lock had thought about the possibility of needing to secure the door from within. She did not open it yet. "You came alone," she said. A pause, brief, honest in its brevity. "Dale is at the base of the trail. He stays there. You have my word." His word. She thought about Ruth Mason on a highway in January. She thought about 13 years of a forged system permits, signed in an official capacity, a lawsuit dismissed before it could be heard. She thought about what his word was worth and what it had cost other people. She opened the door. Boyd Garland was older than she had expected. She had built a picture of him from the notebooks, in the legal documents, in the cold abstraction of what he represented. And that picture had been of someone powerful in the way that powerful people look in photographs, broad and certain and unreachable. In person, he was simply a man in his late 60s, lean and weathered, the way desert men get weathered, with white hair and careful eyes and the kind of posture that comes from decades of standing at podiums. He wore plain clothes, dark slacks, a gray shirt, no tie. He had dressed down deliberately. She understood the same way you lower your voice when you want someone to stop being afraid of you. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he looked past her at the entrance room at the hallway beyond it. "Earl built this well," he said quietly. Not to her, almost to himself. "He did," she said. Garland looked back at her. Something moved in his careful eyes. Not quite respect. Something adjacent to it. The recognition of a quality in an opponent that you can afford to acknowledge because you believe the match is already decided. "May I come in?" he said. "No," she said. He accepted that without reaction. He stood in the doorway, and she stood 3 feet inside it, and the desert evening was behind him. The sky gone fully dark now, the first stars appearing over the ridge. "I want you to understand something," he said. "I don't dislike you. I want to be clear about that from the start. This situation is not personal." "Ruth Mason is personal," she said. A stillness came over him. It was different from the controlled composure he had walked up the trail wearing. This was something that went deeper, a settling the way a building settles when something in its foundation shifts. "Your mother," he said. "My mother." He looked at her steadily. "I didn't order what happened to Ruth." "Then what happened to her?" "A bad road," he said. "A bad night. I know you don't believe that. I understand why you don't believe that. But I'm telling you what I know." She held his gaze and said nothing. He moved on. "What I came to tell you is this. The system you've turned back on is more complicated than Earl's notebooks describe. The distribution network has legal standing issues that go back decades. There are water rights disputes attached to multiple properties in this valley that have been in litigation for years. If you leave this system running in its current state, without someone who understands the legal framework managing the output, you're going to create conflicts that hurt the very farmers you're trying to help." "That's a very organized argument," she said. "I've had time to prepare it." "How much time?" He almost smiled. 13 years since the lawyer filed the transfer documents. So he had known. From the beginning. He had known there was an heir, had known the transfer was filed, had known that someday someone was going to walk up this trail with that key. He had spent 13 years building a legal and institutional framework specifically designed to contain whatever happened when that day arrived. "What do you want?" she said. "Cooperation," he said. "I want you to sit down with my people and work out a management agreement. You hold the legal title to this property. That has value. I'm prepared to compensate you for it. Significantly." He paused. "You're 18 years old with $40 in your pocket, no family and no plan. I'm offering you a way out of that." She looked at him. "You know how much money I have." "I know quite a lot about you," he said. "Howard has been very helpful over the years." There it was, clean and simple, offered without apology, the way you offer something when you want the other person to understand the scope of what they're dealing with. Finch had not just tipped him off this morning. Finch had been reporting to him for years. Everything about her life at St. Anne's, her habits, her temperament, her prospects had been available to Boyd Garland for as long as she could remember having a life. She felt something move through her that was not quite anger and not quite grief, and was mostly a cold, functional clarity. "The filing cabinets," she said. "The records room. That's why Pruitt was so fast." "The warrant has been ready for a long time," Garland said. "I want to be honest with you about that. I'm not trying to pretend the situation is other than it is. Dale took what needed to be taken. That's done. What I'm here to discuss is the path forward." She looked past him at the dark ridgeline. The stars were sharp and numerous above it, the way stars only get in desert places far from city light. "The backup drive," she said. He looked at her. "Earl built a backup drive," she said. "You knew about it." Something shifted in his expression. A fraction of a degree. There and gone. "Earl was thorough," he said carefully. "Did you know what he built into it?" The careful eyes moved over her face, reading her the way a man reads a poker hand across a table. "He built an archive," Garland said. "Data going back decades. Pressure readings, flow measurements, extraction records." He paused. "If you have it, I'd like you to give it to me. I'll add it to the compensation package. It's old data, honestly. Most of it is superseded by current measurements. It would be more useful to my team's analysis than to you." She understood then that he didn't know. He knew the drive existed. He did not know what Earl had programmed it to do. He thought it was simply a data archive, a backup of the records he had just had Pruitt box up from the records room. He thought it was a hard copy of things he already controlled. He didn't know about the transmission function, the recipients, the 18-year timer. She kept her face still. "I don't have it," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "Willa." "I don't have it. He may have taken it with the rest of the records." Garland held her gaze. She held his back without flinching, and after a moment he made a decision. She could see him make it. A small tilt of the head, a barely perceptible relaxation around the eyes. He had decided she was telling the truth, or had decided that pressing further was counterproductive, or both. "All right," he said. "Then let me tell you what I'm prepared to offer." He named a number. It was a large number. It was the kind of number that would solve every material problem she had ever had, and several she hadn't thought of yet. Enough to go to school. To live without working for years while she figured out what she wanted. To build a life from nothing into something without the grinding, exhausting arithmetic of $43 in a backpack. She listened to the number. She let it exist in the air between them. "In exchange for what?" she said. "You sign over management authority for this facility to the Arizona Water Resource Cooperative, which is an entity I oversee. You retain nominal title to the property. The transfer documents protect you legally. You walk away. You never come back here. You never discuss what you found here or what you think you know about the valley's water system." He said it all evenly, no pressure in his voice. Just a recitation of terms the way a man recites terms when he believes the terms will be accepted. "And the farmers," she said, "the families, the people whose wells have been dry for 2.5 years. The cooperative will ensure equitable distribution," he said, "the way it has been for the last 847 days. He did not answer that. "That's what I thought," she said. She stepped back from the doorway. not retreating, positioning. I need a few minutes, she said, to think about it. He nodded. Of course. He gestured toward the trail. I'll wait outside. She closed the door. She did not lock it. Locking it would signal something she didn't want to signal yet. She walked quickly through the hallway into the machine room. The console was running. The distribution map was on the screen, the Valley network showing its recalibrated flows. She went to the console and looked at the inputs, carefully running her eye over the panel, the way she had studied Earl's second notebook, the operational manual. She found what she was looking for on the right side of the console, a data port, a physical connection interface, small and square labeled in Earl's notation system, with a symbol she had decoded from the manual. Input, external drive. She took the hard drive from her backpack. She held it in her hand for a moment. Earl had written in the section of the third notebook she had read most carefully that the transmission function required the drive to be connected to the console input, that the system would authenticate the drive against the bloodline verification it had already performed when she arrived, that once authenticated, the transmission would begin automatically and could not be interrupted by disconnecting the drive after it started, that the recipients had been set at the time of programming and were encoded in the drive itself, not in the console. He had written the system will do what it was built to do. Your job is only to connect it. She connected it. The console registered it immediately. The screen shifted, a new window opening in the lower half of the display, while the distribution map remained in the upper half. External drive detected. Authenticating. A pause of 3 seconds. 4. 5. Authentication confirmed. Mason bloodline verified. Archive contents, 23,847 individual records. Date range 1971 to 2008. Transmission protocol active. Recipient list encoded. Initiating transmission. She looked at the screen. Then she looked at the door behind her, the hallway, the entrance room beyond it. She had perhaps 2 minutes, maybe less, before Garland stopped waiting and came back to the door. The transmission bar on the screen began moving, slowly at first, 1%, 2. The system was old and the drive's contents were enormous, and the transmission was going through whatever communication infrastructure Earl had built into the mountain. Some hardwired uplink she had not yet located, something he had run through the pipes and cables during the years of construction. She needed to do one more thing before Garland came back. She moved to the left end of the console. The mountain lock lever was there, covered by its small metal housing, the protective cap Earl had built over it to prevent accidental engagement. She lifted the cap on its hinge. The lever beneath was smaller than the flow balance lever, thicker, a shorter throw built to engage with resistance rather than ease. She read the label beside it one more time, although she had already memorized it. Mountain lock permanent system seal, irreversible. She heard the door open behind her. Garland had not waited. She had not expected him to wait the full time. He was a man who had learned when patience was a tool and when it was a concession, and he had listened to something in her voice or her posture and had decided that waiting was not in his interest. She turned around. He stood at the entrance to the machine room. He looked at the console. He looked at the screen. He saw the transmission window. He saw the progress bar. He saw the words archive contents, 23,847 individual records, and his face changed in a way it had not changed through the entire preceding conversation. He looked at the drive connected to the console. "What did you do?" he said. Not a question. The flat declarative recognition of someone who has just understood what they missed. "He built a transmission function into it," she said. "All 23,000 records. Going out right now." Garland crossed the room in 4 strides. He looked at the console, at the connection interface where the drive was plugged in. He reached toward it. "Don't," she said. He stopped. His hand was 6 inches from the drive. He looked at her. "If you disconnect it after the transmission starts, the protocol continues," she said. "Earl built it that way. Disconnecting it won't stop anything. It'll just mean I can't see the progress." Garland stood with his hand in the air. She watched the information reach him, move through him, find its way to whatever part of him did the real calculating beneath the smooth surface he showed the world. She watched him understand that the move he had been about to make would accomplish nothing. He lowered his hand. He looked at the screen. The progress bar was at 11%. "Where's it going?" he said. "I don't know the specific recipients," she said. "Earl encoded them into the drive. I didn't program it." He turned and looked at her. The careful eyes were different now. Not panicked. Boyd Garland was not a man who panicked. But the distance was gone from them, the measured assessment quality that had made him feel unreachable throughout their conversation. He looked at her the way a person looks when they have just recalibrated their understanding of a situation from the ground up. "You knew this entire time," he said. "I knew what the drive did," she said. "I didn't know the recipients until just now." "But you knew enough." "I knew enough." He looked at the screen again. 15%. The machines hummed around them. The pipes in the walls moved with the deep, unhurried pulse of water finding its level. Then Garland did something she had not expected. He sat down on the concrete floor. He sat down slowly, the way old men sit when they have decided that standing no longer serves a purpose. And he put his hands on his knees and looked at the console screen, and for the first time since she had opened the door to him, he looked like what he was. A man in his late 60s at the end of something very long. "Your grandfather tried this," he said quietly. "Did you know that not with a drive? He tried to get the records to the state attorney general's office. Directly. Hand-delivered. 2003. He paused. "I had a friend in that office. And it disappeared." "And it disappeared," he agreed. "I thought the same thing would happen when Ruth filed her lawsuit. I had friends in the court." He stopped. "I didn't want what happened to her to happen. I want you to believe that for whatever it's worth." "It's not worth very much," she said. He accepted that. "What do you want?" he said. Not the strategic question he had asked before. Something simpler. The question of a man who has run out of leverage and is trying to understand what comes next. She looked at the screen. 22%. "I want what Earl wanted," she said. "I want the water to reach everyone it's supposed to reach. I want 847 days of theft to be accounted for. I want the people in this valley to have what belongs to them." He was quiet. "And Ruth," she said, "I want someone to look at what happened on that highway." He closed his eyes briefly. "What happens to me," he said, "happens to me. I've understood for some time that this was a possible ending. Earl was a patient man. I underestimated how patient." He opened his eyes and looked at the screen. "I should have known he had a contingency. He always had a contingency." "He had 18 years to prepare it," she said. Garland nodded slowly. She watched the progress bar. 31%. The transmission was gaining speed as the system warmed up the old infrastructure finding its rhythm. "The farmers," she said, "when your extraction pumps stop working because the pressure drops below their operational threshold, what happens to your operation?" "It becomes considerably less profitable," he said. He almost smiled. "The agricultural holding itself can survive. The water theft is what made it exceptional." He looked at his hands on his knees. "I've been doing this for a long time, Willa. Long enough that I stopped thinking about it as theft and started thinking about it as management. That's what happens. You manage something long enough and you forget that it ever belonged to anyone else." "The valley didn't forget," she said. He had no answer for that. The progress bar reached 50%. She could hear, or thought she could hear, something in the machines around her that was slightly different from the hum of the distribution network. A higher note. A faint, sustained frequency that might have been data moving through old copper lines buried in the mountain traveling toward wherever Earl had pointed it. She walked to the mountain lock lever. Garland watched her. He did not get up. He did not speak. She looked at the lever. She thought about what the notebook had said. Irreversible. The word had specific weight. Everything else she had done today could theoretically be undone. The flow balance corrected again, The drive disconnected before the transmission completed, though that window was narrowing. The mountain lock was the one action that had no reverse. She thought about the thing Garland had said, that he had stopped thinking of it as theft and started thinking of it as management. She understood how that happened. She understood the mechanics of it, how any sustained action repeated long enough calcifies into assumption, into the unexamined background of a life. She had watched it happen at St. Anne's in smaller ways. People who had managed other people's lives long enough that they forgot the lives had ever been the people's own. The mountain lock would mean no one could manage this system again. Not Garland's people, not the state, not the Arizona Water Resource Cooperative, or whatever legal entity Garland used to hold his operation, but also not her. The water would find its own level. Earl had designed it that way, a passive system that once locked into its balanced state would continue running on natural pressure differentials in the physics of the aquifer network, requiring no keeper, no management, no one sitting in a mountain room watching gauges. It would simply work, indefinitely, for everyone. She thought about Earl sitting in this room in the years after Ruth died, in the years when he was old and alone, and knew that what he had built might outlast any human custodian. She thought about what he had decided, that the best protection for the thing he cared about most was to make it impossible for anyone to compromise, not even the person who was supposed to protect it. She pulled the mountain lock lever down. The mountain answered immediately, not the way the flow balance had answered, with distant thunder and the awakening rumble of long dormant pipes. This was different. This was deeper. A resonance that moved through the rock itself, through the floor under her feet, through the walls on either side, a vibration that was not sound exactly, but that her body registered the way her body registered things that were very large and very final. Below her, somewhere in the deep stone, she felt rather than heard things moving into place. Heavy things, engineered things, mechanisms Earl had built into the bedrock during the years of construction, geared and counterweighted, and designed to engage once and lock permanently. Stone gates, perhaps, or massive valve housings. She would never see them. She would never need to. The console screen divided. The distribution map and the transmission window remained, but a third panel opened across the top. Mountain lock protocol initiated. Primary seals engaging. Secondary distribution locks active. Keeper interface disabling in 60 seconds. She watched the countdown begin. Garland was on his feet. She had not heard him stand. He was at her shoulder reading the screen, and she could feel the shift in him. Not anger, not the cold fury she had half expected, but something more complicated. The feeling of a structure you built over many years coming down in a way that you watched happen and could not stop. 60 seconds, he said. Yes. After that. After that, the system runs on its own. The extraction pressure in your sector drops as the underground pressure equalizes. Your pumps stop being able to pull against it. The water reaches the whole valley the way it's supposed to. She paused. No one controls it anymore. Not you, not me. It just works. He was quiet for the duration of the countdown. She watched the numbers fall. 50, 40. The transmission bar was at 73%. It would finish before the interface disabled. She was certain of that now. At 30 seconds, Garland said something she did not expect. Earl would have approved of you, he said. He was stubborn the same way, quiet about it, but unmovable. She said nothing. At 15 seconds, the machines around them began winding down one by one. Not the main distribution system that continued its hum unchanged. The control infrastructure. The gauges stopped their small responsive movements. The indicator lights went from their various states to a steady uniform amber one by one down the row. At 5 seconds, the console screen flickered. The transmission bar completed. 100%. A new line appeared. Transmission complete. 23,847 records delivered. Recipients confirmed. And then the screen showed the final message. Keeper interface disabled. System autonomous. The amber lights went out. The screen went dark. The room was not silent. The machines still breathed their deep hum. The pipes in the walls still moved with water finding its way through the network. But the instrumentation was gone. The gauges still, the levers inert, the console a piece of furniture now rather than a tool. The mountain had swallowed its control mechanism back into itself and sealed it there. She stood in the dark room with the lantern she had relit at some point during the conversation, and the flame threw shadows against the stone walls, and somewhere far below the valley floor, water was moving through channels it had been denied for 847 days. She looked at Garland. He looked at the dark console for a long moment. Then he turned toward the hallway. Dale is going to want to come up here, he said. When I walk down that trail alone. You'll tell him there's nothing here anymore, she said. Because there isn't. The interface is gone. The records are gone, sent to wherever they're going. There's nothing left to seize or destroy or manage. He stopped at the entrance to the hallway. Where did Earl send the records? He said. You must have a guess. She thought about Earl's notebooks, about the entries that referenced Ruth's lawsuit, the documentation he had assembled the years of quiet, patient watching, about a 2007 article in a local newspaper, a short piece about a woman who died on a highway buried in the local section, about the kind of journalist who writes that kind of piece and then gets silenced and spends years afterward knowing what he knows and not being able to prove it. She thought about the encoded recipient list, the 18-year timer, Earl sitting in this room deciding who to trust with something he had spent a lifetime building. Someone who's been waiting, she said. Garland absorbed that. He nodded once, a small nod, the nod of a man acknowledging a move in a game he has just lost. Then he walked down the hallway and through the entrance room, and she heard the door open and his footsteps descend the trail and grow faint and disappear into the desert night. She sat down on the floor of the machine room. She sat there for a long time. The lantern burned beside her. The machines hummed. She could feel, or believed she could feel, the movement of water far below the patient network, finding its natural balance, the pressure redistributing through channels that had been bent for too long toward a single destination and were now free to go where the physics of the earth sent them. She did not feel triumphant. She was too tired for triumph and too hollowed out by the weight of what the day had contained. She felt more than anything the specific quiet of something finished, a sustained tension released, the absence of a pressure that had been there so long it had started to feel like gravity. She thought about Ruth, 27 years old, a lawsuit filed in good faith, evidence assembled, a system that had been built to serve justice used against her by the man who controlled it. 3 months of silence after a dismissal, and then a highway at night, and then nothing. She thought about Earl, who had built everything in this mountain, and then sat in it alone for years, after unable to prove what he knew, unable to stop what was happening in the valley below, building his backup and his transmission function, and his encoded recipients, and his 18-year timer, waiting for the person he had hidden in Tucson to grow up and find her way here. She thought about Finch. She thought about what 13 years of reporting to a senator looked like from the inside. Whether he had ever thought about what he was doing, or whether it had become like Garland's theft, something that calcified into normalcy, into just the way things were, into the background of a life lived inside a system someone else had designed. She took the third notebook from her backpack and opened it to the last page. The uneven handwriting. The final entry addressed to her by name. She was never abandoned, she was hidden. There is a difference. She read it again in the lantern light. She thought it would take some time before she knew what to do with that. With all of it. The birth certificate in the folder. The woman named Ruth, who had been 26 when she had Willa and 27 when she died. The man who had built this mountain room and written her name in his final pages. The word abandoned replaced, not erased, but replaced with something more complicated and in the long run more survivable. You could build a life on hidden. You could not build one on abandoned. She did not know this yet in words. She knew it in the way you know things at 18 when you have spent a long day with the weight of old truths coming to light. Not as understanding exactly, but as a physical sensation in your chest, a shift in the way something sits. She stayed in the mountain room until the lantern oil burned low. Then she refilled it from the reserve can on the shelf and sat a while longer. Later, she did not know how much later, she took out the hard drive. It had disconnected automatically when the interface disabled. She turned it over in her hands. The green activity light was dark now. It had done what it was built to do. She put it back in her backpack. She was not sure why. There was nothing left on it, the transmission complete the archive delivered. But it had Earl's handwriting on the back, and she was not ready to leave it in her room. She slept in the narrow bed in the entrance room that night under the canvas tarp. She folded back on a mattress that was old but not ruined. The books on the shelves were visible in the faint moonlight that came through the dusty windows. She lay on her back and looked at their spines without reading them, and listened to the mountains settle around her. She was still there 4 days later when the first calls started coming in from the valley. She heard about it from the second day when she had walked down to Wilcox to buy food with her remaining money. People in the diner were talking about it. A water pressure surge in the municipal system unexplained. Wells that had been underperforming suddenly reading normal. An irrigation system on a farm east of town that had been running at 40% capacity for 2 years suddenly running at full. Nobody knew why. She bought a sandwich and a bottle of water in a local newspaper and walked back up the trail. By the third day, the newspaper had a front-page story about the water pressure recovery. A county official was quoted saying the state was investigating. No cause had been identified yet. Residents were encouraged to conserve while the situation was assessed. By the fourth day, there was a different story. Not in the local paper, on her phone where she had been checking signal intermittently from the ridge above the house. A national outlet. Not a big one, but a real one, with a history of investigative reporting on state-level corruption in the western United States. The headline read, Arizona Senator Garland faces federal inquiry over Valley Water Diversion Scheme. She read it sitting on the rock outside the front door in the morning sun with the valley spread below her. The article described in careful and specific terms a 23-year scheme by which Boyd Garland had used his successive positions in Arizona's water management bureaucracy to construct, permit, and operate an illegal extraction network that had diverted valley groundwater to his private agricultural holdings at a rate significantly above legal limits. The article cited specific documents, specific dates, specific extraction measurements cross-referenced against authorized permits. The kind of specificity that only comes from having 23,000 individual records delivered all at once. The source was identified as a cache of documents received by a journalist named Everett Marsh, a former Arizona Republic reporter who had covered water rights issues in southern Arizona for many years before leaving the paper in 2008 under circumstances described as disputed. She read that name twice. Everett Marsh had been 29 years old in 2007 when he wrote a short article about a woman named Ruth Mason who had died on a highway in January. He had written the piece and then been told by the paper's management that the story didn't merit further coverage. He had pushed back. He had kept pushing. He had left the paper the following year. Earl had known about him, had found the article, had recognized in it the work of someone who had already figured out enough of the shape of what happened to Ruth to be dangerous to Garland, had encoded his address into the drive, had set an 18-year timer and waited for Willa to come and plug it in. She put the phone in her pocket and sat with the sun on her face and looked at the valley below. The valley was very beautiful in the morning. She had not had the attention to spare for that the previous 4 days. Now she did. The way the light came over the eastern ridge and spread down the slope, catching the tops of the scrub brush and the pale rock faces and the dry riverbed that wound through the valley floor. The way the distance reduced everything to shape and color, farms and roads and small clusters of buildings, becoming simple geometric forms in the landscape. She thought about Garland sitting on the concrete floor of the machine room, his hands on his knees looking at the console screen. She thought about his voice when he said she reminded him of Earl. She thought about the complicated grief of destroying something you built over a lifetime, even if what you built was wrong, even if the destruction was just. She did not feel sorry for him. She was not built for that, not today, maybe not for a long time. But she could hold the complexity of it. A man who had done a serious sustained harm to a valley full of people, who had contributed to her mother's death, who had used the institutional power of public office for private enrichment, who had done all of that over decades and had still somehow managed in those final minutes in the machine room to be recognizably human. Tired and old and at the end of a long thing. That was the world. It did not simplify itself for the sake of clean stories. She picked up the newspaper she had bought in Wilcox and folded it open to the water pressure story on the front page. Local farmer quoted, "Well running full for the first time in 2 years. Going to plan a second season for the first time in 3 years." Voice described as emotional. She folded the paper back up. She took the birth certificate from the folder in her backpack and looked at it in the sunlight. Ruth Eleanor Mason, age 26. The baby's name in its designated field. She thought about what it meant to be named by someone who was not there anymore to explain the choice. How a name was a kind of message that arrived years before you could read it. How the woman who had written that name on that form at 26 had known probably that she was sending her daughter somewhere dangerous into a world that contained Boyd Garland and Dale Pruitt and Howard Finch and all the systems those men represented, and had named her anyway. Had given her a name to carry through all of it. Willa. She put the birth certificate back in the folder. She looked at the door behind her, the wooden door set into the rock, Earl Mason, 1971, carved above it in letters that the sun and the wind were slowly taking back. She thought about what she was going to do now, not abstractly, practically. She had $30. She had a backpack. She had a notebook and a folder and a small hard drive with nothing left on it. She had the title to a property that was legally hers and that contained a system she could no longer operate and a room that had been emptied of its records. She had a name, her actual name, which she had carried around for 18 years under a different one, not knowing it was waiting for her inside a mountain in Arizona. Willa Mason. She said it out loud once quietly to the valley below. It fit differently than Crane had fit. Not better exactly. Crane had been the name she had grown up in, and she would not discard it, would carry it somewhere inside her, the way you carry the names of places you live for a long time. But Mason had a weight to it, the specific weight of something that had been yours before you knew it, waiting to be claimed. A week later, she was still there when a car came up the dirt road below the mountain. Not a sheriff's cruiser, a sedan, old-driven carefully over the rough terrain. She watched it from the ridge above the house, and when it stopped at the bottom of the trail and the driver got out, she could see it was a man older moving with the slight deliberateness of someone whose body required more negotiation than it once had. He stood at the bottom of the trail and looked up toward the mountain face. She climbed down from the ridge and walked toward him. He was in his early 60s with gray in his hair and a face that had the particular quality of someone who had spent years being careful about what he let show. He was carrying a shoulder bag, and he was looking at the mountain with an expression that was not quite awe, but was close to it. He saw her coming and stopped. "Willa Mason," he said. She stopped 10 feet from him. "Everett Marsh," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the mountain at the door and the rock face at the name carved above it. "I've been trying to find this place for 18 years, he said. She looked at him. "Earl sent me the coordinates," he said, "along with everything else, in the transmission." He paused. "I think he wanted me to see it." She thought about that, about Earl encoding a journalist's contact information into a drive and setting an 18-year timer, sending records and evidence and all 23,000 documents of a life's work, and adding coordinates. "Come and see what I built. Come and see what it was for." He wanted someone to tell the story, she said. "Yes," Marsh said. "I think that's exactly right." She looked at him for a moment. He had the steady eyes of someone who had waited a long time for something and had learned not to press it when it arrived. "I'll tell you what I can," she said. "It's not a short story." "I have time," he said. She turned toward the mountain. She led him up the trail in the morning light, past the pale rock formations, past the second trail marker, with its worn metal post through the scrub brush, and the clean, hot air of the Arizona desert. The door in the rock was ahead of them, its wood dark with age, the iron lock catching the sunlight, the carved name above it reading the same as it had read since 1971. Below them, visible through the gaps in the ridge, the valley was green with a color it had not been in years. The farms were running. The riverbed showed the dark stain of water finding its way through soil that had forgotten what wet felt like. From up here, it looked the way the whole valley probably looked in Earl Mason's time before any of the rest of it had happened, the way it was always supposed to look. She pushed the door open and walked inside.